There we go. All right. So this is the Reading Wrinkles class. We're going to be going over common fitting issues and what different wrinkles mean depending on where you see them and what angles they're at. The first place that I want to start with is talking about grain. We're only going to be covering woven textiles in this, although a lot of it is applicable to knits as well as non-wovens. But for the most part, we're going to be covering wovens, right? And one of the things that you want to think about with wovens is where the grain line sits makes a big difference as to how the wrinkles pull. So what you want to think about is the warp, right? Or the on grain is the strongest threads. They're the ones that are that have to be under tension to be woven, right? The cross grain is slightly less strong. They can be pretty darn close, like especially with even weaves, like plain muslins or canvases that are even weaves. But it usually has a little bit more give than straight of grain, right? Even if it's a plain even weave. Where you get into the most stretchiness and most wonkiness is on the bias, right? So the holes in between each of the lines going horizontal and vertical. And that can get a lot of stretch. So what that looks like in fabric, knocking things over, scrap here. So you have, let's see here, your straight of grain here, right? Which gives very little. And you see how when that pulls, it's, you know, fairly straight lines and fairly dense. Cross grain has a little bit more give to it. This is a plain broadcloth. There's no actual elastomers or anything in it. It's just plain cotton. But you see how that has a slightly softer wrinkles here, and it gives more, right? And then you have the 45 degrees, which is true bias. You can have anything in between those is somewhat biased. But when you pull on that, do you see how the wrinkles vary quite a bit? And it wants to stay more rounded, right? But it gives a lot. Like you can stretch that pretty far. So that's the main thing that you're looking for as far as how fabrics behave. And we're going to go over, so let's first talk about, remember when we were talking about grain line, right? So one of the great things about plaid circle skirts is it has all of the grain lines and you can see them clearly. So you see how in the hem here, the wrinkles of how it falls is not even, right? Now, if this were on the straight of grain around the hem, or if this was a rectangular construction or a even trapezoidal construction, like you see some of the houppelons that are, well, the single houppelon that I know of that's extant anyway, where it has very even turnbacks, right, on the bottom. Do you see how on where it hits the bias here, it flattens out a bit, right? And then it gets into more even pleats in the straight of grain and the cross grain, right? Some of that kicking out is partially because there's a poofy skirt underneath that. There's a crinoline under it. Hello, buddy. Oh, the cat has joined the chat. Okay. Welcome, William. All right, so that's more or less what you're looking for as far as how skirts drape and where the wrinkles come from. Now, a lot of artists just ignore that, even modernly. Like if you're looking at 1950s, where they were drawing a lot of skirts like this, you see some designers will actually put in, and you can tell this is where the bias hits and so forth, and the wiggly bits at the bottom. But almost nobody does that these days. It just, not that it takes any longer, but it takes a little bit more thought. And usually they just leave that up to the technician. So, man. So whether it's being accurately shown in, oh, you were a swimming little boy. There we go. Accurately in portraits or not, that's debatable. Okay, so we're going to come back to that bit in a little bit. We're going to look at the actual, there we go, practical sides of things. Now, one of the things to be said about these particular slides is they are all modern, right? Looking at period examples, you don't really want to be able to say, oh, or editorialize as to whether this is a good fit, an intentional fit, or not, right? So for the most part, the general assumption is that's the way it's supposed to look. And it's debatable whether how much of it is artistic or whatever, right? So, and I certainly don't want to be putting people on blast, like taking people who have recreated stuff and being like, look, here's this thing, this doesn't fit, right? So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at a whole lot of celebrity butts. It's going to be exciting, among other people, right? Celebrities and politicians and so forth. So that's why the modern stuff is, it's the same sort of fitting principles work. So this is one of the less intuitive problems with trousers, right? And this is the same sort of thing whether you're doing joint hose or trousers or braids or you know, basically any bifurcated garment. These principles still apply, right? So do you see how these guys have lines that are coming out kind of like whiskers, where it's, or kind of like a grinning crotch is sometimes kind of what it's called, whether it's a smiling wrinkles. But mainly what you're looking at is they aren't directly straight across all the way around, right? And what that means is that the run is a little bit too short. And by run, what I mean is if you have a, yeah, let's actually switch to, cat's taking over stuff here. I'm going to go to this guy here, I think. I'm going to stop screen sharing for a little bit. All right, I'm going to draw for you for a second. I'm going to look at what trouser patterns look like. So, if you have, if you imagine trousers kind of like stairs, the rise is the part that goes up and down, right? The run is the part that goes from front to back, right? The part that you step on, your foot would go there, right? So for trousers, it's the same sort of idea. Now, if this was, you know, like those, they get super curvy, right? And it's really long on the side, then, okay, shoot. So what you're looking at is, if you have a seam here, which on a mock-up, absolutely you'd want a seam. Some historical hose, like, you wouldn't have a seam there because that's on the bias, and who wants to sew that, right? But for mock-up, I would definitely have an inseam seam. And this is where, if you have that smiling crotch, you want to make it longer this way, right? So from front to back, you want it to be more like there. Does that make sense? You getting some nods? Okay, cool. All right, we'll come back to the roughly drawn trousers another time. I'm going to go back to some screen sharing here. Now I remember that the green dot is for. Okay, so the next one we're going to look at is the opposite of that, which is a frowning crotch. So you can kind of see it the best on this side over here, but when you have that kind of pooch in the front, that is something that's a very common detail in early 20th century women's trousers. I'm not really sure why, other than perhaps they didn't alter them from their masculine drafts, I guess. But anyway, so for the most part, if you have space there that you don't need space there, it's exactly the opposite of what we just did, right? Is it needs to be a little bit shorter in the run. Now, rather than sticking a pin at the fork, and by the fork I mean where the crotch seam and the inseam run into each other, right? Is it like a fork in the road? Right? Anyway, so rather than sticking a pin at the fork, because nobody wants a pin there, nobody wants to put a pin there, right? That's just uncomfortable. What you do is you have the person that you're fitting it on face a mirror, and then along the center back seam, you pinch out as much as you need to until the front sits against the person, right? And the back as well, but you're working from the back. And then you put your pin in there. And basically what you do is you measure that same distance, and that's the amount that you take out. So you're not guessing at, do I take out this much, do I take out that much? I take out some. What you have is you have the exact distance. You just don't take it out there. You just measure that and then move it to where you'd actually take it out with the fork. Does that make sense? Kind of, sort of. So here, I'll switch back to this for a second. Okay, so let's look at this guy again, and maybe I'll switch to a blue so you can see a slight difference. So in the fitting, where you would pin it would be right here on the center back of the butt, right? And rather than having a seam that goes there, which nobody wants, right? What you do is you measure this distance from here to here, or however much you took out, right? And let's say it's a 1/2 inch. You take out that 1/2 inch here at the fork. Yeah? Okay. Cool. Onward! Yes, to share this one. All right, so this is basically that same thing, but what it looks like from the back. You also see here the wrinkles underneath the butt, right? That's something that it may seem intuitive to want to let it out, or to like move it in from one place or another, or to take it out of that bit. But if it's evenly all the way across underneath the butt, part of what that is that it's probably slightly too tight around the butt, and you want to release it out so that it can walk its way up. And then you want to scoot the whole thing up up the leg until it's smooth. You see these wrinkles a lot in 15th century hose when they've undone just the back of their doublet to hose kind of onesie outfit. We'll look at those in a little bit too. And that's more or less why, is because the waistline and the hip line is drooping. And that's where you get those lines. For these guys, they literally cannot scoot up further because there's just not space. So if you get these and you have the waist where you want it to be, that's what you want to do. Is you want to let it out a little bit and then scoot it up the body until those wrinkles disappear. All right, so remember when we were talking about whiskers and the difference between whiskers and smiling crotches and straight lines that go all the way around the body? So this is more or less what straight lines around the body kind of look like, right? Now, to be fair, a lot of these are too small in circumference because they have stuck their hands in their pockets, which is kind of a fan service thing that a lot of celebrities do. But for the most part, what this means is that it's too small all the way around. Where you'd want to let this out is probably at the side seams, or if you're doing hose at the side backs, which is the one spot that you have it. But that's what that means, is it's too small all the way around. All right, so this is more or less the same sort of problem that the butt wrinkles, under butt wrinkles were, except underneath the belly, right? Now, there is absolutely nothing wrong with curving the center front seam of trousers or hose, right? If you have someone who is particularly round in the front, like myself and included, right? There's nothing to say that you have to keep that on the straight grain. It can make it a little bit harder to put in a fly, but like for the most part, we aren't putting in flies anyway. So the only more difficult part about that is that you have to have a 3-part facing, instead of just like self-facing for the, as the cat tries to Godzilla the camera. Please don't. There we go. All right, so basically this is the same sort of thing. It's too small over the belly, and so what you want to do is you want to let it out there so that the fabric can walk its way back up the body instead of trying to run its way to a smaller spot. All right, so this is one thing that I wanted to talk to you about as far as something that is fixable with anything that's at least 80% wool. So if you look at these trousers, right? Now, to be fair, the one on the right is absolutely just too small, right? And the guy on the left has his hands in his pockets, which makes it too small. Although it is a little bit too small over his calves. You see how his crease line completely disappears over his calves? That's part of it, right? If you get guys that are particularly athletic or curvy, this is something that you may run into where it clings in places you don't necessarily want it to. To buy yourself a little bit of extra space, one of the things that you can do is you can plunk your wool down with it, folded over on the spot that you want extra. So let's say a calf, right? You have to fold it over the center back of the calf. And what you can do is you can stretch that wool by pulling it and steaming it to get that little bit of extra curve so that you have hose that go yeah, yeah, instead of necessarily. Does that make sense? Yeah. You can always press out the crease line later. Like, you don't see a whole lot of joined hose with a crease line. But if you're making trousers or trunk hose or so forth like that, this could be useful too. Okay, so basically what we're looking at here are satellites kind of coming down towards the center, right? They're not all the way around, and they're not really creating a frown line. They're kind of cupping the butt, right? They're like a little flower frown sticking up. Now, what this is more or less that you have cut your trousers or your hose with the legs a little too bow-legged. So the distance going this way in between the body is a little bit too long and it's tilted slightly at the wrong angle. So more or less what that does is you want to be careful about your grain line and what angle you have it at. And you can take some of that fullness away on the interior of your thigh to get rid of these guys. Okay, this is not terribly informative as far as what we tend to do. We don't have a whole lot of full-length trousers, right? But one thing that I do want you to think about is that if you have trousers or skirts, or if you want your hose to get to the top of the foot and it's very tight, right? You can't really have it come down very far. The thinner your circumference around the hem, the higher up those trousers have to be. The wider the hem, the further it can go down towards the ground. So if you have like a skirt even, that can be all the way to the floor and you're not going to run into toes, and that's fine. But you know, when you have trousers, you have to stop where the foot starts to come down, which, yeah, not as ethical for our stuff. All right. So this is one that I talked a little bit about in our sleeve class yesterday. This is an unintuitive sleeve fitting issue. So you see how it kind of has that dent right on the top of the sleeve there? It's not really a problem with the sleeve. What it is it's a problem with how tight the back of the coat is. This is not one that you're going to run into except for guys that have like the 15th century multiple layers. If you're getting into you know, some of the fitted Italian sort of coats and so forth. If you have multiple layers and this is an outer layer, you might start to see that you get these little chunks in the sleeves. And what that is you want to let it out at the center back of the cotehardie rather than at the sleeve, because it's too small breadth-wise across the body rather than too small at the sleeve. And that's the little shark bite kind of here. I put this guy on the right here just so you have a little bit of relief of what it should look like as far as smooth fitting goes. All right, so this one's a pitch issue. I talked about this more yesterday, but basically what you get here is that the arm is at a slightly different angle than anything else. So what you want to do is you want to pop the sleeve head off and drive it like a car until the wrinkles go away. All right, here are more horizontal wrinkles. Now that you've seen horizontal wrinkles on hips, it's the same sort of thing with sleeves. It means it's too small in full circumference. That's the same pitch thing. Okay, so this one is one of those ones that's once you see it, you can't unsee it. So you see how it looks like you have plenty of fabric over the bicep and so forth, but you're still getting wrinkles across the top of the sleeve head, right? What that is that the sleeve head itself is too narrow. So basically the bit that goes over the top of your Armscye is smaller than what your actual Armscye is. I'm going to grab my fake Armscye over here for a second. Switch. Here we go. Okay, so we have our nice little fake Armscye here. And yeah, we're good there. So basically what that means is that your sleeve head is further in here. So it's more like this when your actual Armscye is wider. So on your pattern, you want to make your sleeve head wider. The over part versus the under part. Okay. And away we go. Okay, so this one is more or less gapping at the collar here. So as far as the center guy goes, this is more or less the difference in when you put something on someone else, you run into different problems. The gap in the collar here is it's too wide at the center back, so you want to take it in there. The drooping kind of sad lines coming down from the shoulder basically means that you need to take it up at the shoulder seam or stick shoulder pad in there. Not that we have a whole lot of shoulder pads in period, but there is some interesting kind of structural things in there too. All right, so let's talk a little bit about arm size and what kind of difference that makes as far as movement goes. If you've ever, made a garment for someone who moves in it quite a bit, you'll probably have noticed that the higher and tighter the arm side, the more you can lift and wave your arms. This is why I like using presidents for this, because they wave and things that are woven. So you have these very high and tight arm size, and the higher and the tighter the arm side, the more that they can lift their arm and wave without moving the entire rest of the coat. Like if you look at our presidents here that are more modern, right, when they start buying their suits more off the rack rather than custom made, you get these massive chest breaks, and that's that same sort of thing. So that's the end of sleeves, more or less. So chest breaks, right? That's basically only really useful for like early Tudor stuff. So like Henry VIII might have a chest break if he got too broad in the shoulders or in the chest for his garments, more or less, or Waffenrocks, same sort of idea. So basically when it breaks like that, where you get that kind of brackety sort of shape, that means that it's too tight across the chest. All right, so this is too big. If you can hide a ham sandwich or a whole fist in between you and your lovely doublet, that's too big. All right, so this is the whole gap collar thing that I was talking about before. That's just a little bit closer up. That's more or less too big across the shoulders, so you take it in at the center back. All right, so you see how these lines are pulling at the button? That means that it's too small at the waist. Now, if it fit all the way up, so if this were a cotardie, then it would have horizontal lines all the way across, right? But because this has the 1 point of tension, you do get the whiskering from it. So once again, that's one of those ones that you run into differently. Okay, so this one is a matter of posture. So if you run into these, the little wrinkles at the back of the neck, that basically means that you need to move your neckline down a bit and open it up a bit so that their neck can stand more upright in it. You do run into pretty much anything that you put on a person that has a high neckline. You will see this if it's just a little bit too tall, right? If it's a little bit too close to the neck at the back. So houppelons, cotardies, that sort of thing. All right, so do you see the wrinkles coming down kind of sad from underneath the arm here? This is one of the less intuitive ones, I think. Basically what this is that the shoulders are too sloped. So you want to go up to the shoulder seams and pull it up until the Armscye is at a better angle. So that it doesn't like droop down and have those pull lines. You'll run into this in pretty much anything that has shoulders, which is almost everything that you put on a person. Now, with some eras, you'll run into this, and this is absolutely a style choice, that you have those kind of hanging, pulling lines, but that's a lot of rectangular construction. And this is our last ones. I promised that we would be looking at celebrity butts, and this is our last set of celebrity butts, I promise, for now. So basically when you see the pulling across the butt, that means that you need more space over the hips. Right, and it's the same sort of thing as far as seeing gapping if there's a gore that needs to be bigger, or horizontal lines if it's fit all the way around. All right, so let's talk about some period examples. All right, so one of the lovely things that we can see with how things hang and wrinkle is how thick the fabric is, most likely, as well as how much interfacing is likely in there as well. And I'm not talking about the stick-on stuff, like linen linings and horsehair linings you can find in a bunch of different extant pieces in museums. So that's part of what some of this is. So if you look here on the left here, you have these really soft wrinkles, right? And they're dense, and there's lots of them, right? Especially on the forearms here and where it's tucked up into a belt here. And basically what that's showing is that that's a very thin and lightweight fabric. Could you not knock over the camera, please, buddy? It's like, no, I must shake it. Playing Godzilla. But if you look at this one, look at how dense those wrinkles are at what is probably where a gore would be if it's a rectangular construction, which is most likely here. And you can see here even what might be indicating an underarm gore, or gusset, which is very exciting, right? And as opposed to the flatter ones at the front. So whether that's intentional, but you see it here too, right? Where you get the denser towards the sides and flatter at the front. As opposed to this guy here where you have very even all the way around, which makes me think that there's probably an inner layer in there that is specifically woven at that angle, right? So like a strip of linen canvas or something like that, or it might just be that that's how stiff the ribbon on top is to be able to get those even kind of curves. Now we have kind of in the middle here on the far right here, those fairly soft drapes. You see here some moderately stiff tenting. So the weight of this fabric is probably somewhere in between these two. What we have here on the left is, once again, a very thin fabric that's been densely pleated, right? And you can see how dense those turnbacks are. Now, this is specifically pleated, right? You can see some of the smocking and so forth that's here to be able to get those very dense pleats. It's almost Fortuny-esque as far as how dense those pleats are. And that's how you get it so close to the body as well. But it's still probably a very lightweight fabric considering how it hangs and how you get the turnbacks here. We've got kind of middleweight here and very stiff here as far as your very even turnbacks. As opposed to the very soft, you get some bigger turnbacks and some smaller turnbacks, which may be indicative of where the grainline is on this as well. All right, so I love this middle example right here because it shows some pulling lines here, right? So very much this looks like it has a nap to it to me, but this is probably fuzzy. But check out on the curve here where you have these little lines coming out from there, which if that bit on that curve is on the bias, and you didn't quite hang it out long enough, that's exactly what will happen, right? Or if you didn't back it with something that was stiffer, or although you might get this anyway, right? Just because the bias will want to droop a bit. So I think that's fascinating that you can actually see where the straight of grain is. Oh, you want to go? Okay, there you go, girly. See where the straight of grain is as opposed to where the bias is hanging out. I also love the Grand Assiette sleeves here where you can see the big Armscye. But you also see this is very stiff, right? Which is probably stuffed and stiff that way. As opposed to here where you have all these intricate, yes, it is not food time. I know you think it is. And you see some pull lines at the elbow here, so it's fairly tight there, but softer wrinkles down the forearm, as opposed to here where you can see, well, the grain line on the Charles Dubois fur point has been really well covered by Cynthia Virtue if you want to go and check out her website. I'm pretty sure it's linked in the handout. Oh, I forgot to put the handout in the chat. I will do that before we go. All right, let's look at some hose, right? So remember when I was talking about how you get the underbutt wrinkles here from when they don't have the back tied up? That's a good example right here. You have some underbutt wrinkles, which, as you can imagine, if it was pulled up and tied on, it would still have the room to get there because of those wrinkles, right? You do also have to keep in mind that look at how these wrinkles fall around the knees. That definitely shows, I would say that that's probably on the bias to be able to get there. You can see the pull lines to where it's tied up here. But you also need to remember that you need to have enough space for the knees to be there when they're bent. Same thing with heels. In general, you want to make sure that when you are fitting hose, that they have enough space to bend. And that's, you know, it's the same sort of reason why when you see old movies with stodgy old, you know, characters or like professors or like old money types, that they will almost always grab their trousers, pull them up, and then sit down, right? And what that is, more or less, is protecting the knees of their trousers from getting bowed out and pulling over their knees. So that's still a modern phenomena. If you are used to wearing trousers that are meant to last your lifetime and are very expensive, you'll probably pull up your trousers to keep your knees from getting worn out. But I love these guys. I love the the amount that's left here anyway is neat, and those amazing curves that you can get there, as well as what it looks like this way. Ooh, there we go. All right. Remember when I was talking about how plaid is awesome? Plaid is awesome for showing what the grain line is. I love these guys. They do show the knee wrinkles here, but also that on the bias totally works. As well as you can see the wrinkles coming off of this exant piece as well, where you can see the wrinkles coming at the grain and cross grain right along here, which shows that it's also bias is on the at the same parallel as gravity is. More stripes and more knee baggies, which is great. You can also see here some of the tying to get tight there, as well as underbutt wrinkles and softening wrinkles here. Once again, with his top down, which makes a lot of sense as to why you'd have that wrinkle there. Knee bags, all the knee bags, and underbutt wrinkles. See where he has it untied in the back as well? Can beat that dead horse for a while. And we're back to the super soft fabrics, medium kind of fall of the fabric, and the super stiff fabrics. So do you see how dense these folds are? Is on our, you know, lovely Tudor queen here. And that shows how stiff that particular fabric is to be able to get that kind of architectural sort of wrinkles and pleats to it, as opposed to here you can see the kind of softer wrinkles, and very even pleating up here makes me think that's probably controlled. That's probably not just left to be pleated wherever, because it wouldn't be evenly pleated that way. Same with these guys here, where that's probably very thin fabric. You do have some scrolling here as opposed to even pleats here. So that's more or less the difference between what's going over the body partially. So that's partially that there's a leg there, therefore it takes up space, right? But also probably in the controlled pleats as well. So the difference in the hem here as opposed to the hem here, it kind of tells you how densely and how controlled those pleats are. And how soft and how thin that fabric is, that you start seeing the pulls and the pooling underneath the knees. All right, so that, my friends, is reading Wrinkles. Do you have questions about some proportions then? So one of the cool things about humans is that you can kind of parse out where on the anatomy and what scale everything is by measuring the head. Most figures have a head. If you have something like this guy right here, that's hard. That's hard to do the math on because there is no head, right? But if you're looking at a portrait and you have someone who's standing and you want to say, is that a bust that has been lifted up? Is that a, where does the waist actually hit on that? Where are her hips? Because it's all covered in fabric, right? So more or less, here are a couple of rules of thumb. So when you measure the length of this guy's head right here, right? Or this lady, I suppose. I'm not sure. Who can tell? So if you measure the head right here, and you take that measurement and you put that measurement directly below the head, and same length, right? And put a line. That's where the natural bust would be. So if the curve is above that, then you probably have some sort of stays or some sort of structure to help move it, right? If it's below that, it may have a flattening kind of influence, or just relaxed and not a 13-year-old. The next line below that, if you take that same head measurement, you go down, get your bust line, same measurement to the waistline, right? Another thing to look for with waistlines is almost always your elbow is pretty darn close to your natural waist. And by natural waist, I mean, okay, so imagine your skeleton. You have your ribs and you have your pelvis, right, in the top of your pelvis. And the space in between those varies quite a bit depending on the person, right? Some people, they touch, that your ribs and the top of your iliac crest on your hips touch. Some people have very long vertebrae of those particular vertebrae, and then they have a dramatic hip spring. So the difference between where their ribs are and where their hips are. And basically, it's where the natural waist falls at the center between those two hard points. So it's kind of like if you take a t-shirt and pull them between two of your knuckles, right? If you have two fists and you're pulling a t-shirt over those two fists, where it dips in the center is your natural waist. And that's more or less what I'm talking about. Now, fashionable waists can be anywhere. They could be on your hips, they could be underneath your bust, they could be moved anywhere. And that's something worth noting, right? So to find the waist, that's two heads down, waist. Also look for where the elbows are. The next head down is more or less where your crotch hits. So that's the lowest, a little bit lower than the lowest part of your butt, right? So evenly across at the butt to the crotch. And then, so one of the things that you'll run into as far as stylized goes, oftentimes, especially modern artists, will shove extra heads in the legs. Long bones are where humans differ the most as far as our major alteration points are, right? So whether you have 4 legs or whether you have 3.5 or whether you have 3 legs, in the length of your legs can vary greatly, especially if you're looking at a statue or a figure that's supposed to be drawn in such a way that you are looking up at them, right? So basically any fashion figure drawings are going to be 9 heads high, as opposed to character drawings or realistic measurements, right? And I'll put this link into the handout too. So one of the cool things about, you look at this Elizabethan portrait, right? Queen Elizabeth, and you look at those proportions and they're insane, right? Like they look like they're inhuman. And yet, if you space it out, you can totally fit a human in it, right? If you start to do the math of where does that actually hit on the body, you can make your proportions look that much more like a portrait by doing the math and figuring out where does that actually fit. Even if it looks like it's a crazy proportion that no human is actually that shape. And the answer is no human is actually that shape. It's a lot of optical illusions and creating that figure, but it can be absolutely accurate depending on what portrait you're going off of. Another thing that you might want to look at is how do you figure out how wide those skirts are, right? You can do the same thing. You can measure the head and then measure how many heads wide that skirt is. And especially if I'm draping something on the form, what I'll do is I'll take a little bit of blue tape and I'll mark out how wide that skirt is supposed to be on the floor so that I know that I can hit that circumference as far as the proportion goes. Same sort of thing is with if I'm dropping the waistline or moving it someplace else, or if I want a raised bust, you want to make sure that you have the right underwear to get the structure. Does that make sense? Okay, so let's see here. Nope, not that one. All right, so proportions. You can also break it down with a little bit of math and ratios, exactly how big something is. Like if you want to see, so this is pretty obviously underneath the bust, right? That's a very high waist. But if you want to say, okay, is that belt actually going to be 2 inches on me versus 2 inches on this portrait? You can actually do that math of this is this proportion of her head, and this is that proportion of the belt, and multiply it out if you want to. You can also eyeball it. Not everything is math, no matter how much I want to make it all about math. But if you're struggling with it, like math is a great way to figure it out too. Let's see. Same sort of thing. Like I did could you not watch off of that, please? He's camped out behind the camera and making threats. One Charles Schwab per point that I did, I played with keeping all of the ratios the same, but still blew it up to be able to fit me, and that was fascinating. So that all of the pieces were in proportion to the original, just my size instead of very skinny dude size. So basically, the only spot that actually is my size is at the waist. The rest of it is all that size. All right. Let's see what else as far as proportions go. Those are some of my favorite tricks as far as figuring out, so how wide is that skirt? Which also it makes a difference of what it's made out of too, right? Like one thing that I'd recommend is making a little sampler for yourself. If you're going to be trying to test out, is this a very thin fabric? Is this a very thick fabric? To be able to get to those wrinkles, is do a little test thing. Like see, is this skirt done with cartridge pleating? Is this skirt done with 2 times fullness at the hem, or whatever. But some of that you can picture out from the or figure out from the portrait itself. I only covered the most common things, right? So if you run into a wrinkle that you're like, that wasn't on the chart, feel free to email me. I love getting my brain picked, and I've seen a lot. As far as everything from dowager humps are very common. Scoliosis is very common. Almost no one is even right to left. So if you're doing measurements, that's one thing to keep in mind, or drafting, or making something up. Almost always, if they're right-handed, just measure their right side, unless they're asymmetrical on the vertical axis, right? So if they have scoliosis or something like that, you'll want to measure both sides. But for the most part, right-handed people, you can measure the right side and you're good, because the left side is almost always smaller. For superhero movies, stars, what they do is they go and they literally hire someone to work them out so that both sides of their body are even. It's not something we naturally do. That level of symmetricality is abnormal. It's very pretty, but it's abnormal. Or unaverage, I guess, not necessarily abnormal. If someone is left-handed, you'll want to measure both sides, because it's a crapshoot. Who knows, which side is going to be larger? They live in a right-handed world, but are left-handed, right? So that's something to keep in mind. As far as the variance of humans, yeah. Also, if you're interested in finding out more about how and why we came up with average sizes, which are a whole kettle of worms as far as, wow, that's inaccurate. Why is that inaccurate? I would highly recommend the 99% Invisible podcast on average. it goes over the whole history of how we came up with average sizes and how we attached a moral understanding of if you don't fit into these sizes, then you must be bad. It's all Kedley's fault. Well, it's not true. Kedley is not entirely your fault. That was his opinion. That if you weren't average, you were bad, which is had a lot of leftover badness in informing eugenics and all sorts of stuff that's not actually based on reality. But yeah, not to get too far into the ethics of things, but thank you so much. I will put a link to this when I get it edited and so forth up on the thing so that you guys can have it. And yeah, so until next time.